I would like to welcome everyone to this month's ReproNim webinar. We are super excited to have our very own Yarek to present on some topics. Yarek is a research professor of psychology and brain sciences, an adjunct associate professor of computer science, and the director of the famous Center for Open Neurosciences, all at Dartmouth. He claims his areas of expertise are neuroimaging, machine learning, software and data distributions, open science, and data standards. Today, Yarek will talk to us about slow flow yoga. Slow flow yoga is a mindful, deliberate, and low intensity practice that connects breath with movement at a slower pace than traditional vinyasa yoga. Oh, no, he's talking about ReproFlow YODA. I apologize, Yarek. I think I better turn this over to you to tell us what you're really going to talk about.
Oh man, actually I want slow yoga, right? That's a good one. Thank you for introduction, and in the best traditions, I decided to save everybody time, and I will not even talk about ReproFlow and concentrate on YODA aspects or YODA principles to be precise. And another reality kind of check or disclaimer before we proceed. Actually, let me see if we can proceed. Hey, here we go. So in this talk, I will not solve all the problems, but hopefully we'll find or provide solutions or point to solutions to some of them and improve your practices, how you do research or how you promote people to do the research. And all of this work, it wouldn't be possible without all those wonderful governmental institutions which provide us with funding to do all this work, but also people of projects such as DataLab and people working with me at the Center for Open Neuroscience at Dartmouth. So I'll start from this slogan, which I adopted it from my kid's poster. In her case, it was about one Tylenol a day keeps death rate at bay when she was talking about C. elegans research she carried out in scientific camp. But in our case, I think even adopting a single principle a day for you, it will really improve your, well, if you worry about your hair, then it will be amount of gray hair or just amount of hair in general. So for more ideas about ReproFlow, which I kind of crossed out, we have a webinar which I presented 2 years ago about the ReproNim approaches to data acquisition. And here we will concentrate on YODA principles, which we actually formulated a number of years back for SOHBM poster. And only now we started to work more actively to publish them as a paper so others could actually discover better uh, what they're about. But I would advise you to maybe have a peek at that poster if you didn't get some ideas which I'll try to deliver in this talk. So what our principles are about, we'll go through all of them in particular. So first principle is probably already dear to your heart. It's version control everything. So what we proclaim or demand from you is use version control even where you didn't use it before. You need to use it for everything. For your input data, for your custom analysis, code, scripts. So don't just throw them around on your hard drive and forget where they are, but put them into some repository, under some directory, under version control. But also put all your compute environments, either it be specification from which you could reproduce it, or even entire container binary image under version control, one way or another. So why do you want version control in general? It's to collaborate. This is how people started to collaborate using Git more intensely than ever before with more centralized approaches. But another one for me is just to keep things synchronized. We synchronized before also through copy or famous command rsync, which allows us kind of to figure out what is the most up-to-date version. But nothing is better than Git in terms of keeping things in sync, even within the same file where different parts are changing. And that's another part, keep track of changes, right? How things came about and keeping this provenance information. Another approach, and that's how I, let's say, backed up all our Dandy archive through DataLab, which we developed, which is version control system, and I use it as a backup. That was initial idea on how Dandy sets appeared on GitHub. And then another function of Git, which I use daily and number of times, is Git grep. which allows us to actually limit our scope of work to only what we version control. Because usually if you run grep and it starts going through all auxiliary files and version control files, you don't want that. What you want is really to look through the data which you keep on the version control system. So by keeping it there, using tools which version control system provides like git grep, makes your practice cleaner. Okay, but another aspect which is not here, and typically when I give a talk, I ask people like, what do you use version control for? But what I use it increasingly more is actually to experiment. And that's typical software development pattern, right? So you create a branch, you create alternative timeline in which you try things out. And I don't know if Manny's here, but she listened to my talk on YODA and then about other technologies that distributes, and now she's creating those Git work trees left and right to experiment and try to reproduce her findings with her 2-photon calcium imaging data. So what Git gives us these alternative timelines and ways to experiment. And worktree is another mechanism which is still under used, I would say, but really efficient and really important in the scope of Git Annex because it allows you to reuse the same collection of data in Git Annex while working on different work trees. That's why the name worktree. But another one is actually to allow us to experiment as to try things out and go back in the history. So you introduce changes, you run some commands, and then you could go back as it never happened, right? You could do git reset hard and clean, and see, nothing happened, and you start from clean slate again, which allows you to control how reproducible you are, actually. Because then you depend only on the current state, you do something, and then you could go back and actually do it in a clean way with the commit. Or you could even do pretty much full fancy time travel. You could git reset hard to any previous commit in your history. So you could scrape away part of your experiment, which you, let's say, decided that it's not worthwhile keeping in the history, and keep only clean history this way. So what YODA principle would say is you need to track everything, your data, code, and computational environments to produce analysis outputs in those version control datasets. And that will assist your reproducibility. So tracking we kind of figured out, but another really strong paradigm, I would say, which we introduced in DataLab was realization that if we do this way, that we start from clean state, then we run some command, and then we commit the result, we could just encapsulate it into one helper command, which is in our case is data-led run. And you could use data-led run even on pure Git repositories. They don't need to be Git Annex repositories. They could be pure Git. That's what I usually do when, okay, that would be a question to the audience. And probably many people know now that I do this code spell, not challenge, but litmus test to the projects. I submit them PR with code spell fixes and see how they react. So in this case, I use data-led run to run code spell. Then I have a command encoded in the commit message, and it looks similar to this one. So all commit messages which are made with data-led run, they encode the command which you run and potentially information about inputs and outputs. So in this case, command specified which inputs were and what were the outputs. So this establishes us basic provenance information, how we've got to this commit state, right? We know that we came from previous commit because that's what Git is about. You start with state and you go to the next one. But also now we know which command we've run. And all of that information is captured kind of for free for you. Just instead of running the command, you prepended it with data-led run and potentially specified what is the input and what is output. So now you don't need to guess how this commit came about. You don't need also to come up with a commit message if you really don't want to describe. You just specify, oh, that was the command to run. And also there is no surprise, right? So you start from clean state and go to a clean state, which is otherwise hard to achieve because you might commit some specific files, but not the other ones. Okay, and what's happening here? Poster, website. Yes, I hope that people will help me out there in the chat meanwhile. So we collect this provenance, and I want to relate now to activities which are happening in BITS project, and I will not introduce it here, but because most of you already know what BITS is about, there is BITS Enhancement Proposal 28, which has been in the works for a while, but I think it's on the verge to be considered for the next minor BITS release. So I would advise you to go and check it out. And if with data-led run, we collect the provenance, which we can actually convert to standard prov records, which is standard, which is developed by W3C, worldwide consortium, which came up with all the standards for HTML, XML, and prov. That's why it's originally based on XML, which captures this information about provenance in standard terms of activity, entity, and an agent. So it's pretty much what kind of event happened, right? That let's say it was Yarik who ran the data-led run command, right? And then entities, inputs, outputs, that's what we specified in there, and tools, that's the command which I've ran, right? So we separate out also activity in this case, and that will be pretty much what you have in the commit message. Who ran that commit? So that's why we could convert those commits into full-featured prov records. And you could see on the left that this is pretty much this relationship between entities and agents, but because it's linked web, it could link to various other descriptors to describe those entities and activities in greater detail. And I would advise you to look at the official docs if you really want to fall asleep right away, because it's really dense information. But to make it more digestible to humans, people usually use JSON format with this LD flavor to it. LD stands for link data. Hopefully you've heard about that. And I would advise you to visit this BITS PR 299 to see various examples, but I'll show you one of them. So in this example, in a file in prov directory, we record that activity, which we did conversion from DICOMS to Nifty using DCM20X. And as a result of this activity, right, we potentially created some files, and that's the information which you'll find in the sidecar files which were produced, pointing to this activity by its ID. See it? Everything in linked web has IDs, and this conversion ID will be the one which referenced in the sidecar files. So unlike original prov document, which would link everything in one file, in BitsProv, we separated it out in different files, so it becomes also human accessible and easier to manage. So with all that kind of simple approaches, we already accomplished a big deal, right? Now we know how we've got to that state, right? We recorded the activities which led us to it in regular version control with commit messages, so nothing really out of this world. But another magic part comes from now we could take those commit messages and we could rerun the commands which were recorded in them. So it really looks like magic. And if you arrive at exactly the same result, you could do git diff and it should be exactly the same, right? And or you might spot that, oh, timestamps were introduced and timestamp changed. And then you maybe look into your code and see where maybe you don't need to record timestamps, right? Or you might want to do some other kind of based on what you achieve as that difference. And as such, we introduce concept of functional cherry picking. So in Git, you know that you could just git cherry pick and you take the diff and you apply it to a new tree. But with such data-led run commits, if you do data-led rerun, it goes and cherry picks, which are regular commits, but then it reruns the commits which were data-led run commits. What do I achieve this way? Let's say I mentioned you fixing typos. Imagine that I had data-led run commit, which recorded that I ran code spell -w, which fixes all the code spell errors and writes it down. That patch potentially might conflict, might no longer apply to another place in tree. But if I rerun that command, so it will be functional patch, it will run and it just will perform the duties which it was supposed to. So this way, it's not really hard-coded change, but it's rather functional description of what needs to be accomplished. So talking about reproducibility. And if you want to discover more of where there is more of such examples of data-led running, I would advise you to look into and listen to the talk which Isaac gave. Isaac works with me at Center for Open Neuroscience on registry of data-led, and also John, who worked with us, he created this data-led usage dashboard where we automatically discover not only data-led datasets in the wild, but also where on GitHub people have repositories where they record this data-led run command provenance information. And that repository keeps growing. And at the moment, then we take all of those data-led data sets we discover and we push them into registry. Registry is what Isaac works on, and Kyle was working with us, who was actually the original author of data-led rerun implementation. I think run Michael created, and then Kyle improved on rerun. And you could see that we have over almost 2 terabytes of data sets mentioned, and many of them also have these data-led rerun entries. But how many? If you look in this data-led usage dashboard, which is just a JSON file, I updated the count. So from 2 months ago, we grew additional 100 records. So probably it was my code spelling activities, but who knows, maybe not only, but also the number of repositories increased pretty much by 100. But overall, what is good to see is that among those data sets, actually, I forgot to update the second number. So this statistics is not right, but hopefully we are not decreasing proportion of the data sets in which we have these data-led run records. So I would advise you to start using data-led run even when you are not using data-led for anything else. So if you use git, install pip install data-led and do data-led run whenever you run some command and want to commit the results of that execution. But what we thought about originally in data-led, and then Joey of Gitanix just implemented in addition, he implemented git annex add computed. And that is the functionality which will soon, or maybe already rely, I didn't check recently, in fMRI prep. So in fMRI prep, as many of you might know, we have data pre-processed and aligned to many spaces where it could potentially spatially be aligned. But this aligned data is really expensive to store, right? Because instead of one, let's say, gigabyte file, now you'll have 5 gigabyte files. Although this transformation is really deterministic, right? And could be recomputed pretty much on the fly whenever it's necessary. So now with this git annex add computed backend for git annex, I could store original file and then store how it could be recomputed. I mean, this derived data resliced to a specific space could be recomputed or converted, right, into that another file. So now we don't have to distribute all spaces. We just need to distribute original data and translations from that into another space. If you want to discover more, listen to the talk of Michal from Distributes 2025. He describes you not only add computed, but also comparison to the data-led special remote, which was created by him in data-led. And another missing piece from all this capture of provenance we kind of didn't fulfill for a while, it was capturing of standard outputs and standard error, and also diagnostics about running that process. And those of you who ever used BrainLife of Franco Pistilli project, what you discovered is that it has this really nice graphs when you run compute, it provides you computation about how much memory or CPU it was consuming. So, and Franco is our collaborative project, so we didn't feel ashamed to take part of his code and build upon it. So Conduct was born out of idea which we had before, but also some parts of the code within BrainLife to monitor running process and collect those statistics. So, and then it stores them aside in the file. So let's say in this case, this is example where I just modify my data-led config for container execution and say just, oh, use duct to run that command. And as a result, what we'll get additional files recorded with standard output, standard error, and some protocol of memory usage and CPU usage of that process or any of its children. Because we established new sessions, so we could monitor for this tree of processes and collect that information, which is collected at a sampling rate, which later you could plot. So you could plot, and we created duct gallery project. So if you create your own plots by using duct, we have duct plot command, and it looks any pretty. Please submit us to this gallery so we could visualize, how it could look like. So in this plot, you could see that consumption of CPU and memory, how it went through time. And this is an example of running MRIQC on one of the Open Neuro data sets, which is Felix did at ULIC a few months back. Okay, so let's summarize this principle one. We just went through first principle in the in YODA, right? So the overall goal is to version control everything. In our case, we controlled it to not only to just store everything, but also to experiment with this data-led run, reset dash dash hard, and also embed this actionable how can you achieve reproducibility by recording which command brought you from one state to another. It's like with a pipeline, but kind of poor man execution of it with Git right there at your fingertips. And also you could record artifacts such as memory consumption, CPU consumption, and standard outputs, and also allow for this functional patching. So, but overall, why do we do that? And here comes an interesting relation to recent movies, which I hope you watched. So again, in audience, I would ask, like, what is the name of the movie? And it's Don't Look Up, right? So what happens usually in life is that you start recomputing something and it depends on a file which you didn't track, right? And you need to look for it somewhere. And this principle of don't look up, it means that you don't look somewhere else outside of your folder that depends then on untracked file, right? So once again, version control, please learn and use it more, even if you didn't use it before. Okay. And second principle was portable compute environments. I kind of already brushed over using containers with datalet when I mentioned introduction of conduct. But overall point is that not only you need to version control your code, but you need to know where to run it or how to run your compute pipelines or just steps. And for that, you need to use computational environments. Okay. The problem is that quite often, even though we worked on NeuroDebian for many, many years and we resolved many problems, but installation of software still could be somewhat difficult or sometimes even impossible. And it became much, much easier with the years. So it's not like it's unsolved problem, but there is still sometimes corner cases appearing. And especially it used to be especially harder on shared systems when it was difficult to install. Now with mini condas, anacondas, and UV, it's much easier even at HPC. But still, the problem is then, external resources might vanish. If you're, let's say, using PyAnts, because it's so big, Brian keeps only the most recent version on PyPy. So if you decide to reproduce previous release, good luck, right? It will be gone from PyPy. So even if you have your recipe, how you created that environment, it's not necessarily you would be able to regain it. So older builds might just not be available, right? But also different versions of software and operating systems could produce different results. So JB's group is working on investigation. Many people work on comparing, which parts of the pipeline or which aspects affect your results in a significant manner. So that's one of the references to continue to consider. So one of potential solutions, so it's not the solution, it's a solution, is software containers. So they allow you to encapsulate all the software environment, right? So you get all the pieces in one package. And they isolate your compute from outside operating system, or at least they can to some varying degree, right? So at least your space of the path names by default should be isolated, and a network could be isolated, and potentially GPU could be isolated. And there are different families of containers, as you might know. There is Docker and Singularity, or for Docker, there is now Podman. And also for Singularity, there is Obtainer. I will not go into details of their difference, but what's good happened within past half a decade, I think, that there is better agreement on type of container architecture. So there is OCI, Open Container Initiative, which defines how containers should look like. And Singularity itself converged on a specific Singularity image file format, which could be converted to from OCI, and I think vice versa. So at least there is compatibility established between two approaches. And what is beautiful about SIF is that it's a single file. Because of that, we even worked on establishing archive of Singularity Hub, who is old enough to live that long to know about Singularity Hub. It used to exist as a platform where people shared Singularity containers for research, but then it disappeared. Not disappeared, we provided backup for it, but it's gone and it's no longer maintained. Also, in collaboration with our data-led partners in Germany, we developed data-led container extension, which allows us to take those containers and place them into data-led dataset. So now you pair together not only code and data, but also computational environments. So for data-led dataset, it's just yet another file, and data-led config, which I skimmed through at some point, defines you how you execute that container. Based on that technology, we established big collection of ReproNim containers. We take all bits apps, we convert them into Singularity, and we store it within this dataset. What it allows us is, first of all, to make them readily available, because Singularity is usually what's used on HPC. So now you have one dataset which you could install, and it will have a copy defined up to a checksum of that Singularity image, which you could use and without duplicating it all over the infrastructure. But it also provides us as a community a backup of such containers. So later on, people could go back to this collection and reuse specific version of specific bits app. And also we were working to include original OCI images in this collection as well. So what you should do now, instead of data let run, you should add the container into your dataset, and your dataset could contain those containers inside of it. And then you could use containers run, which will ensure that you obtain that container if it was shared somewhere else, and then it will unlock all your outputs, run the execution, and save all the results. So now you're kind of achieving this collection of things, which is similar to if you ever use CodeOcean. It's trinity of code, environment, and data. And all of them here, they live in the same dataset. And as a result, you will then obtain a clean record of execution of how did you achieve these results, let's say, of your MRIQC. Oh, you've used this container, which is available within this path, within your dataset. Don't look up, everything is down there, available within your dataset on this source data, and you produced some outputs. It doesn't even say here. It's like everything what is committed, then considered to be output. Okay, to summarize at this point, this is principle 2. Portable compute environments, they allow you to know exact version, availability, and provide accessibility to all those containers. And then what you should do, you should not depend on where you do that execution. If you have that data set, it doesn't have any absolute path looking outside. You could move it around and you could run it anywhere. Well, at least that's the promise and that's the hope. But you saw my first slide, which was a disclaimer. Your mileage might vary. Okay, and let's go to the third principle, which is modular composition, which again, we kind of skimmed here and there. But the point is that we need to structure our collection of resources in modular way. So you could reuse any particular one without potentially requiring all necessary resources which you used in this study. So, and we already deal with modules on our regular life, in our regular life on daily basis. It's files. In the basic principle, module is a file, right? So we put relevant information into one file, right? All those bytes in one file. Then we group together multiple files into directories. And then in software distributions, we group files and directories into packages. And those packages with those files, we quite often package into containers or virtual machines. But you can see that there is this hierarchy, right? They all establish grouping of the other modules through some kind of transformation, right? So that's how this modularity is usually achieved. And we already deal with various layouts in our lives, right? So we use layouts, let's say, if you use Linux or even Mac, there is file system hierarchy standard, which we agreed how across different Linux distributions we should structure our file system. And XDG is also takes care about our desktop up files. And by the way, on this YODA skill, I here, because I mentioned operating systems, if you like version control and you use Linux, install etc keeper, which will keep all your configuration files under etc under Git. Okay, and back to our broadcast. So we already have also project layouts. So usually they're defined per project. Let's say you develop some Python toolkit, right? Oh, usually you structure it in a specific way. You have docs folder, you might have your module name as the first level directory, or you have src as source where you put that directory. So we kind of already agreed on some, right? And typically not very nested. So we don't take one Python module and place it inside of another Python module unless we do some kind of vendorization. So based on this principle, in 2018, we suggested some hypothetical layout for a research project, which would say that, okay, you have your code, but then you have third-party library, which would be this sub-data set. It will be sub-module, Git sub-module. Containers could be that ReproNim containers collection, which also you could reuse across different projects. And the same with your input and, let's say, which in which case your input could be, let's say, pre-processed fMRI prep dataset, but that in turn also has access to original bits dataset from which it was computed, right? And in this case, with this modularity, what really matters is that you have tight version control if you not obey, but adhere to the first principle. And size doesn't really matter because you use Gitanix to keep all the big files, including data and containers, under Git version control. So this was what we proposed in 2018 when bits was like 2 years old. But since then, because we agreed on bits, we decided, okay, let's just adhere to bits layout in all or in most, if not all cases. And this is a snapshot which is somewhat dated now. So if you go to NiPipe now, NiPoppy, into NiPoppy now, which I'll mention later as well, NiPoppy originally had or still has its own default layout, but we suggested, okay, let's refactor it so it will be somewhat like bits, minimalistic changes from original NiPoppy, or even more so. But this could be also done to other, let's say our ReproNim fella Seb Nastasi, he went to Princeton and he converted people there to all kinds of ReproNim ways. So they started to use ReproIn, but because we didn't agree on how we structure our studies, they came up with their own. So they came up with code and data separation, but that one could also be done as bits. And that's what Sam did in all these exercises. He converted some other layouts and YODA itself, right? It could be represented as bits. So if we agree how we structure our data and we then have this technology Git submodules, right? But why Git submodules? Because we use Git, right? And that is already technology which exists. Originally, when we started DataLab, we tried to do with our own way. And that was difficult because then you need to create entire machinery around that, and that was tough. So we decided with Git submodules, because it provides all those interesting features. You could link to external resource, it points to specific version, and it allows to associate with additional metadata with them, and they could be installed and uninstalled as needed. That's the beauty of them. So if you've worked with submodules, you could do Git submodule init and D init, so you could put it in and put it back out. And the questions come, when do you introduce those submodules, right? So the main idea is that you introduce a module when that thing which you put into submodule could have its own life. Let's say it's collection of containers which you could use in different repositories. Maybe it's some metadata schema which you also could use in multiple data sets. Or it might be your bits raw, which you could use in different pre-processings, right? That's where it becomes important not to put it inside of your bits raw data set, but keep it outside, because then you could reuse the same raw data set in different pre-processings. Maybe you decide to separate private versus public pieces, right? Or maybe domain specificity, so you could share some portions with some domain, which they don't care about neuroimaging. You better have all your demographics data in a folder, so you could just share this demographics data independently. Okay. Another approach is one-to-many relationship. That's pretty much what I said, raw versus processed data, that you could combine them in various ways. Another one is just to fulfill, and sorry for a little bit shaded image here. Another one is when you need to modularize because you have to. So let's say you have a repository with hundreds of thousands of files. Then Git will struggle. It will not be able to well, it will be able, but life is short. So you should really split it into more manageable pieces. As an example of scalability for such kind, here it's Dendyset 108. I don't remember, it's like 2000 submodules, I think, which point altogether to 300 million of files within ZAR files, and altogether covers 300 terabytes. So it's one Dandy set and covers this much. And this is a kind of a test that it could be done that way. Another aspect is file systems restrictions, primarily on inodes. For that one, which I don't even mention here, but RIA stores is one of the solutions which Michael Hanke group came up with and use extensively in their case. So it's something to look after if you have inodes restrictions. And also, if you are choosing which file system to choose, this is old benchmarking, which I've done across file systems. And that's why I ended up using BetterFS, which scales up really nicely for me. More examples and more info on this kind of how you compartmentalize, look into handbook of the datalet. Okay, so another proof of scalability is this datasets.datalet.org, which contains over 8,000 sub-datasets and 6 levels deep. And all of that is just one kind of Git repository. You could Git clone it and get submodules for every one of those nested levels. And this is not complete stats. It constantly gets updated. So another nice image from AI and Austin about YODA all the way down, right? So you have one yodified dataset sitting inside of another yodified dataset, and you keep growing that way. And the idea is that now we just need frameworks and systems which will facilitate such approaches. So one of them developed by the group of our own JB and his group. So it's NiPoppy, which is originally was created to facilitate compute across multiple modalities and also be bit aware and provide stronger support for phenotypic data. And what is important also, from get-go, they developed this dashboard with NeuroBagel. So as nobody is perfect, they provided solutions for some portions of YODA, but let's say some of them are still loose, in the sense that data version is still a question, but you could use datalet on top, and that's what Austin did when he took NiPipe framework, and even if NiPoppy framework, and if it's internally it doesn't use datalet, you could use it on top of the framework. And I just want to promote a mini symposium which we submitted for this upcoming SFN. If it's accepted, then we'll be talking more about NIPOPI and other solutions which allow you to establish these workflows going through different stages of your scientific exploration. And another solution I want to feature in my talk after I manage to get to the new slide. What happened? Okay, at least I switched this way. BEPS. So BEPS is the framework for facilitating fairly big workflow analysis, which Michael Hanke did a while back on UK Biobank with data-led, but more scalable way and more templated way with BEPS. So it allows you also to create template of how to submit your jobs, scaling across different subjects, and then everything gets merged and controlled with data-led. With this way, they process thousands of subjects. Another project is from Brazil, and he is in the audience, so if you have more questions, also you could ask him. This one is a multi-site approach to take data-led and YODA principles and apply them on top of GitLab deployments. And MinIO, who doesn't know MinIO, it's a S3 provider, so it's like in the cloud, which is used by AWS, but this one you will have on your premise, and it federates across different sites. So I would advise you to talk to Brazil, but also to listen to his talk at Distribute, which he gave last year. And with such approaches, we could get back to this figure which I showed, I hope, that where we could structure them all the way, now that we have this YODA all the way down, we could start with raw data, we nest it in bits, we nest it in fMRI prep into your analysis, and all the way to the paper. So you could share the module paper, and which will not have any of them, but because you have mechanisms built in how to obtain them, you could potentially get to all the way down. And if you recorded your commits with data-led run, then you have also ways how to rerun them or just to discover how they were executed. And you could see that there are modules, and some of them could be even reused. Let's say containers module, which lives on our server, but also lives on GitHub without data. But also all those containers could live in additional spots, additional locations that's providing resilience or maybe higher performance to obtain them. And typical workflow, you could go to our ReproNim containers, which provides you a really minimalistic example. You could try on your hardware in your data and see how it goes. And as a result, what you should achieve is pretty much those commits which you already saw. If you want to look for more examples, I would advise you also to listen to the talk Joe gave in Distributes 2 years ago about ReproMan, which is our project in ReproNim, which we developed to also orchestrate execution and scale it up. And this one was used for all the open neuroderivatives which are shared under Open Neuroderivatives Organization on GitHub. I will not talk about it more, besides showing some examples. If you go there, you could find all those derivatives pre-processed. And what is interesting about them, that in each one of them, you will find location connector to the containers, ReproNim containers, then to the auxiliary code they use to execute with ReproMan, and then original data set, which was used to compute that derivative. In some cases, it might be multiple data sets which will constitute your raw data set, and there is such studies in OpenEuro as well. And as a result, then in Git, you have committed the whole protocol, how everything was executed. So you could introspect and check out results of execution. And that was done even before we had conduct. So now with conduct, we have a better means and standardized means how to capture all of this information. So with this approach of modularity, what we're really achieving is kind of creating our work surface. So we're creating, let's say I'm working on a paper now. I creating the work surface. Oh, I will use these data sets from which I'll extract my figures. I'll use this code which exists in that module. So pretty much you're creating this work surface while allowing for depth to be actually preserved and be linked into. So it's like, and sometimes you could create these petri dishes, like you brew your work tree with some experiments and you throw it away. And that is allowed because of this modularity and version control, that we have powerful tools which allow you to experiment. And with such, if you have surface and you keep your depth, sometimes you would be really, really amazed what you could pull out from that hat, or from that bag. You just get some light repository, but then you start digging and you get deeper and deeper and deeper until you discover all holy grails of what is in there, really. So this frozen frontier or frozen surface becomes kind of another core pattern how we advise you to work with the data, right? So you freeze the state of what you're working with, right? And then you freeze this frontier for your current task. You preserve the connection, so you still have these submodules which point to a specific version. And then you work at the frontier daily, but still have access to those original things. And that's where all those concepts of modularity and provenance, they allow you to establish and work without losing connection, which is really important. But also you could potentially update later on. Let's say your data set underneath changed, you update your surface by reflecting of what is updated, but it doesn't mutate automatically under your feet. That's another problem. If you just rely on online resource, they update it with new version, and that's it. You've got now a new version. Good luck figuring out what changed, right? So this is universal pattern now, frozen frontier. So, and it's nothing new really. That's how people keep working for years, right? You pre-process your data and you work with that pre-processed data. You don't look into your raw. In a FEES, you take your traces, right? And then you do spike trains, right? So you do spike sorting and you work with spike sorted data. The same in neuroimaging. We take DICOMs, we don't work with DICOMs, we convert to raw some nifty bits. Then we compute derivatives, we work with that. So we have these frontiers through which we go to, but quite often we lose connections, and that's important. And the same in software. Let's say I'm Debian developer. It's really important to have access to sources because from sources we build binaries. If we just distribute binaries without linkage to sources, that's it. Good luck. You've discovered a bug, you cannot fix it. But by keeping this clear association, you have it, right? And the same like at the higher levels. Let's say you have archive, you establish snapshots of the archive. That's why we have snapshots.debian.net, which allows you snapshot the entire archive and go again, this frozen frontier. Our tool I forgot even, we have so many tools. Ooh. In ReproNim containers, we could freeze. Then we have another freezing tool to freeze your app specification so it would use snapshots, right? And defreeze. You could freeze to use snapshots so you could reproduce your environments from Debian or NeuroDebian. But the same with publishing, right? So DOI gives you specific pointer to specific version of things. In some other domains, you have history, which point to specific workflows. Again, these frontiers are really, really important. And what is a common principle kind of behind all of them really is again the same. Don't look up, right? You need to look down. You need to look at your surface and what is beneath it. Don't look into the cloud. In a sense, don't look up. So it would change, right? You need to look into the connections you established on your paper, in your GitHub, in where you have it on your table, kind of, and must rely on what is researchable down within hierarchy within your current module, and must produce mostly its own content. So you create the data set, you put sources in there, and then you produce this result. But again, but why? Because typically what you acquire, to avoid exactly the same problem again, right? It depends on some untracked file. It's like if you look up, that's it. And this is again, this same figure, it's don't look up. You look at the analysis. Analysis doesn't depend on the paper which produced based on it. If it does, you make paper, again, sub-module of that analysis. You could even make this loop. So analysis would depend on previous publication of that paper. And that's legit, right? With Git, you could establish them. Okay, let's take corollaries from this. All related data should be version controlled, containers, and that what means also that you must not use absolute paths anywhere. Everything should be relative paths and no hard coding full paths anywhere. And that makes those modules portable. Okay, getting even closer to our final messages and data-led or not, but become friends with YODA. So this frozen frontier approach, it's really useful even without YODA. Just think about this notion that you freeze the state in which you're working on. And this pattern universal. It's not only data-led, but again, I've mentioned some examples. Keep all materials under VCS, use data-led run, look into BEP 28, dashboards. That's another topic which I didn't skim. I skim over, but dashboards and observability of the data is really important. How, if we have this collection, how do we observe the state? How do we know that everything is computed, that nothing failed? People usually ignore the errors. That's the problem. Data-led run helps you to avoid the mistakes that because it fails, it doesn't commit. But the point is that observability and reproducibility help you to get kind of trustworthy results because you could look at them and dig inside. But what is beyond all of this? Beyond code and data and containers? What we are working on, I didn't embed in here, but especially with AI. Now we need to create these collections of knowledge which exist everywhere. We share it on our social media. We share it in Shell. We share it in Zoom recordings. We share it in YouTube videos, GitHub issues. We spread all our knowledge around. And by knowledge, I mean, let's say our mistakes, right? We've tried some analysis, it didn't work, and we, asked somewhere, but then a year after, maybe it's ourselves who find us in the same pickle and need to dig up, how did we resolve it? And maybe that issue already archived and not present online. That's why this kind of data herding, that's the name I gave to this conceptualization issue number 2, which I advise you to go and maybe even state your desires in there. But that's what I'm working on to provide these mechanisms how we could collect all our data, including metadata and social, and create this entire collection so it's reachable and mineable by our trustworthy AI assistants. So on this, I'll surrender and thank you for your attention. Please follow the YODA and let efficiency and reproducibility be with you. I'll take some questions if anybody's still not asleep.
The force is quite strong with you, Yarek. That was fascinating. To warm up the questions, pretty minor thing, perhaps you mentioned it and I just missed it. In these container collections, is there any sort of standard representations of the materials within any given container? I know from poking around at, ReproNim containers, they're often named in kind of, fairly good ways in terms of determining it's, MRIQC version, blah. But given a random container that I want to commit, is there a formal way to say this container contains specific uh, information?
Well, the problem is that the answer is yes, but also that the answer is yes and it's plural.
Okay.
As always,
So no
there is
standard.
no,
Yeah.
there is standards.
Ah,
Let's
okay.
say within Singularity, the same Vanessa who was doing Singularity Hub, she was really interested in providing this additional layer on top, right, of Singularity, which will tell us that. Then let's say you could talk to JB and his group, they are working on standardizing through boutiques, right? And boutique descriptors live inside the container. So potentially you could discover not only version, but the interfaces. The same, let's say, Flywheel, they have their own gears, they have their own manifest. They describe it their own way. So again, there is many ABCD apps from Brain Life. So there is many of them. But what we are arriving at least in Beats, there is underused Beats app 2.0. If you go to Beats website, there is a specification right there where the effort goes into, okay, let's stay boutiques and let's make it, formalize it together with Beats app principle so we have it more consistent. So we should just get there and do it, I would say.
Great, thanks. Other questions? I hope you have the ability to unmute yourself if you do. If not, raise your hand and we'll deal up Nikhil. Are you able? Up there you
Yep.
go.
Sorry, should we let Austin ask first? Oh, I'm not sure.
Oh, your hand's there. We'll get to Austin in a second.
Okay, cool. Great sermon as usual, Yarek. I did enjoy listening. I was curious, how do you see the NeuroDesk initiative fit into all of this?
That's a shame for me to not mention Neurodesk at all. So for those of you who don't know, and you could even correct me, right? So Stefan, he was associated with one of the brain hacks. I think that's where Neurodesk came out from. So Neurodesk creates a versatile collection of containers where they prepackage different tools, but also they then integrate them within the desktop environment because containers quite often deliver not just one tool, but many. So by installing container and then entering the hooks into the container, you allow to not abuse, use the tools present in that container, potentially many. So how I can see it, if we improve this discoverability, what Dave pretty much mentioned, right? So if we have good registry of containers and which tools they provide, that's what Neurodesk actually does, we could potentially make it even better in a sense that I talked about AI, right? So you have collection and you tell AI agent how to discover where it could find the tools of interest and what those tools do and which versions they are. And then it would be for it to deploy Neurodesk container. Neurodesk containers are all indexed also within our ReproNim containers. So what we need to have as one of the projects is to extract that metadata into some consistent machine and human readable index. And we'll just take advantage even at that level without even using maybe much of Neurodesk other principles. But also we could advocate Neurodesk people to use Neurodesk more because then it puts people into mind of using the containers. So, and I could talk about Neurodesk, I guess, much longer even because they give talks for hours too.
Great. Did Austin want to say anything about the comment he made?
Not really. It is a common problem though, like with security. Like if the nice thing about containers is that they're contained, right? But they also can become a black box, and maybe they have installed on them some version of some software that has a security bug. How do you automatically find that? How do you know not to use that container anymore? It's an open problem.
Great. Job security for us all. Great. Other questions? If not, oh,
I have
yes,
one
please.
naive question, David.
Sure.
Just because it's my first venture into data lab and the whole repronym, so coming from someone who has not heard a lot about this, are there some resources you can point to, Yarek, like where someone who doesn't do neuroimaging at all, but does RNA sequencing, other kind of sequencing, like a use case or example where people have taken some of these resources to kind of recreate this YODA environment or the whole basically containerized modular infrastructure along with the data
Uh,
sets.
yeah. So as I mentioned, working slowly, but hopefully more faster nowadays on Yoda paper, and we will relate to various aspects how people do it also in other domains. Many of them, they do some kind of pipelines and some kind of containers already. So they do it to their own degree and with some versioning. I've mentioned Galaxy, one of the most known bioinformatics pipelines, right? I think it supports containers, right? They have their own registry of pipelines, even if I remember correctly, right? So then it becomes a question, how do you instrument, right? So how do you instrument this record? So later on, if you have it, how do you re-execute? It would be useful to look, I believe, Arrow Crate is one of the standards now in bioinformatics, how people export their products, right? Which provides description for what is inside. but it would be worth looking into either it contains any provenance information, how it came about, and could it be reproduced. So as for complete turnkey data-led bioinformatics example, that's a good question. I should ask actually maybe Kyle, who used to work with us and then he went to industry and into one of such bioinformatics endeavors because he was always kind of on the boundary between the two fields. I'll check with him. Maybe he'll point me immediately to some pre-cooked example, but it would be great to create one. If you have an example where you did it not YODA way, I would be happy to work out with you, oh, let's do it YODA way.
Oh, you want more work? I can give you more work. Absolutely.
It's investment, not work. It's an investment in the future. Any more burning questions? If not, we all know how to get a hold of the greater ReproNim community and Yarek and the TRND3 team in particular. Thank you for attending this month. Next month, March 6th, will be Camille Ugerbil from University of Minnesota, probably talking about some sort of Brain Connects initiative they're doing there, but stand by for the actual title coming up. So again, thank you again, Yarek. That was fabulous, and we'll see you all again next month, and stay reproducible out there.